The sting of her hand still burns on my cheek, and the echo of her words cuts through me. "Give me the keys to this house, old woman. It's mine now." In that moment, standing in my own living room, I felt like a stranger in the very place I had built with my late husband. The house that held my memories, my love, my life, reduced to nothing more than a prize for someone who never respected me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, heart hammering, my glasses slipping as I trembled. Because when your own daughter-in-law raises her hand against you, it's not just your skin that stings, it's your soul. This is my story. I'm Katherine, an older woman with short white hair and glasses, and today you'll hear what happened the day my daughter-in-law demanded the keys to my home. Welcome to Katherine Stories, where every story is real, raw, and full of heart. Before we dive deeper, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It means the world to see how far these stories travel, and your comment helps this video reach more people who need it. Let's begin. It started on an ordinary evening. I had just made tea and placed it by the window where the sunset painted the curtains gold. My son and his wife had moved in temporarily after facing financial struggles. At least that's what I was told. When they first arrived, I felt nothing but relief. My son was back under my roof, and for a mother that felt like a second chance. I thought it would be an opportunity for us to grow close again, to sit at the table and share meals, to laugh the way we once did when he was a boy. His wife was new to me, still a stranger in many ways, but I told myself I would embrace her. Families are built on patience, aren't they? So I welcomed them with open arms. I gave them the larger bedroom, the one with the balcony, the room my late husband and I had shared for so many years. It broke my heart to move my clothes and memories into the smaller guest room, but I told myself it was temporary. I thought kindness would build bridges. I thought love would be enough. For the first week, I tried to ignore the small things. The way she rolled her eyes when I offered her tea, the way she sighed loudly when I hummed while cooking, the way she whispered to my son late at night, her voice sharp, followed by his silence. But soon, the whispers grew louder. They stopped hiding them from me. The stares became sharper, and the comments, oh, those comments pierced me day after day. Why does she still control everything? Why is her name on all the papers? Why do we have to ask for permission in our home? Our home. That's what she started calling it. Those words were like knives. I had poured my life into this house, from the curtains I had sewn by hand to the garden my husband and I planted together. Every corner told a story, yet in her mouth, it became theirs. The demands started soon after, small at first. Change these curtains, they're outdated. Then bigger. Sell the old furniture, it looks cheap. And then sharper. Why don't you just give us your bank card? We'll manage the expenses better. I tried to reason. I tried to remind them gently that this was still my home, that the bills were in my name, that I wasn't incapable of managing my own life. But every word I spoke was met with a scoff, or worse, with silence from my son. That silence, it was the deepest betrayal. I could forgive her for not loving me, for not respecting me, even for being cruel. But my son? The boy I had raised alone after my husband passed, the boy whose school lunches I packed, whose clothes I mended by candlelight when times were tough, the boy I held through every fever, every heartbreak. He said nothing. He looked at me like I was a burden. I started to shrink inside my own house. I stopped sitting in the living room because it felt like I was intruding. I stopped cooking the meals I loved because she complained they were too greasy or too old-fashioned. I spent most of my time in the small guest room, surrounded by boxes of my husband's belongings, clutching his photo as if it could give me strength. And yet, even in those moments, I tried to remind myself, they're young, they're struggling, maybe it's just stress. Maybe love would still be enough. But then came the night that stripped away all illusions. I was in the laundry room, folding clothes. It's funny how something as simple as folding a shirt can carry so much peace. I remembered how my husband used to tease me for folding everything so perfectly, even the towels. "Katherine," he'd laugh, "you're the only woman who can make a towel look like art." Those memories were the thread that held me together. But that night she stormed in, her footsteps heavy, her eyes sharp, her voice dripping with contempt. She didn't knock, she didn't ask. She stood there, arms crossed, her lips curled into something cruel. "You don't need this big house, Katherine," she spat. "Hand me the keys. We'll manage from now on. You should be grateful we're even letting you stay here." Her words hit me harder than any slap could. Grateful? For the right to stay in my own home? The house my husband and I built brick by brick, paying off loans with sleepless nights and hard work? The home where I raised my son, where every wall still carried his childhood laughter. I froze. My fingers trembled on the fabric I had ironed with love. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would break my chest. "This is my home," I whispered, my voice breaking under the weight of everything unsaid. "The only piece of my husband I have left." But my words didn't soften her. They didn't even slow her down. She looked at me as if I were nothing. And then the slap came. Quick, hard, real. The sound echoed in the small room. My glasses nearly fell from my face. The laundry slipped from my hands, scattering like broken pieces of my pride. I stumbled back, clutching the edge of the table to steady myself. For a moment, the world blurred. It wasn't just the sting on my cheek. It was the shattering of something deeper. Trust, dignity, love. I looked at her, my cheek burning, my heart breaking. And I turned my eyes to my son, hoping, praying for him to say something, to do something, to remember I was his mother. All I saw was silence. And silence, in that moment, was louder than any slap. That slap wasn't just a strike. It was a declaration, as if a judge had banged a gavel and sentenced me to irrelevance in the life I had built. The room seemed to tilt. For a second, the world held its breath. I turned toward him, desperate for protection, for a word, for anything. My son, the boy who had once crawled into my lap with scraped knees and a secret smile, stood there like a stranger. His face was quiet, his eyes down. He didn't reach out. He didn't pull his wife away. He didn't say, "Enough." His silence felt deliberate, heavy, and cold. I wanted to collapse, to curl up on the floor and let the hurt swallow me. I wanted to run to my husband's photograph and press my forehead to it and ask for the courage to make it through. I wanted to scream so loud the whole neighborhood would hear that this was not what family looked like. But the air caught in my throat, and all I could do was breathe, one small, ragged breath after another. Instead, something changed inside me. It wasn't a sudden blaze of righteous fury. It was quieter at first, a small, steady flame that began to warm the numbness. Years of folding shirts and packing lunches and kissing foreheads had taught me patience. Yes, but also a stubbornness that never quite left. I felt that old stubbornness stirring, not to be defiant for the sake of it, but to survive without being swallowed. I walked slowly to the drawer where I kept the spare keys. My hands, which had trembled a moment earlier, were oddly calm now. The keys felt familiar in my palm, cool and heavy like a promise. Placing them on the table was a gesture that would have surprised the younger Katherine, the one who always tried to fix everything with kindness. This Katherine moved with a different steadiness. A quiet decision had been made. I would not beg for what was mine. I would not make myself small to make others comfort. Table. If these keys mean more to you than respect, then take them, I said softly, the words slipping out like a stitch in a seam. But remember, walls don't make a home. Love does, and you've already lost that. Her smirk told me she believed she had won. My son's silence felt like agreement. The house, for a moment, seemed to echo with the absence of the man I had raised. Not the loud, clapping kind of absence, but the slow, hollow kind, the kind that sits in chairs and leaves their shape in the upholstery. After they left the room, I stood in the doorway and watched them walk away like ghosts passing through a life that used to be mine. The kettle on the stove began to whistle, a sharp domestic sound that seemed absurd in the quiet of the moment. I turned the flame off with hands that finally shook, and the small act of making tea, something so ordinary, felt like reclaiming a small piece of order. That night, I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the slap replayed, slow and merciless. I replayed other moments, too. The first time he rode a bicycle, the time he brought home a report card with neat A's and a crooked smile, the nights he was sick and I kept vigil, the afternoons we planted roses together that finally bloomed each spring. All the pieces of a life felt rearranged, like someone had picked up a carefully set table and shaken it until the plates rattled. I found myself considering choices I had never imagined making. Pack my bags? Leave this house that held a lifetime? Move in with a niece? Sell the furniture and downsize? The practical questions multiplied. Mortgage, bills, memorize, each one a small anchor. I sat at the small kitchen table, my husband's photograph in front of me, and tried to weigh it all. Tears came, but they were not the only thing. Beneath them was a cool, clear thought. Whatever I chose had to preserve my dignity. The next morning, I did something small and necessary. I opened the windows to let the air sweep through the rooms. The sunlight found the dust motes and turned them to gold for a heartbeat. I made a list in a neat hand. Who could help, what papers I needed, where the important documents were. The list was practical and unwavering. The act of writing steadied me. The world had not ended. It simply required a plan. I reached out to an old friend, Mrs. Ahmed, who lived 2 streets over. She was sharp as a new pin and had a voice that never wasted words. When I told her, she didn't gasp or offer platitudes. She said, "Come over, now." Her certainty felt like armor. Over tea, she said things I needed to hear. "You did not raise him for this. He's not a child anymore, and silence is still a choice." Her words were blunt, but they were true, and truth has a way of clearing the fog. Neighbors began to notice a shift too. In the weeks that followed, a few familiar faces appeared at the gate with cautious concern. An elderly woman with a basket who asked if I needed groceries, a man who had once borrowed sugar and returned it with a smile. You'd be surprised how quickly community becomes a scaffolding when your world trembles. Their presence didn't fix everything, but it reminded me I was not completely alone. There were afternoons I sat on the back step and watched grandchildren play in yards across the street. Their laughter was a kind of medicine. I allowed myself these small comforts. A walk to the corner store where people greeted me by name, a phone call to a church friend who sang hymns over the line because I had said I couldn't sleep. These were tiny acts of self-preservation. Simple rituals that mended the fraying edges a little at a time. I also began to look at the house differently, not as a tomb of loss or a battleground, but as a ledger of memory. Each photograph was an entry. Each cupboard held a story. If they wanted the space, they could have the rooms. But the memories, those could not be handed over like keys. I had been the keeper of these memories for decades. I realized then that keeping them did not require me to shrink or vanish. One evening, after days of quiet contemplation, I unfolded myself in front of the mirror. My face looked older than it had the week before, lines deeper, hair wispier. But there was a light in my eyes that wasn't about anger. It was the light of someone who refused to be erased. I applied my glasses, smoothed my hair, and practiced the words I might say if my son ever asked, "Why won't you give the house?" I would not beg. I would remind him softly of what matters. If he could not hear it, then that would be his loss. That resolve did not come with fanfare. No sudden epiphany, just many small decisions, each one like a thread, weaving together until a blanket of resolve formed around me. I knew there would be hard days ahead. I knew hurt would linger. But at some point, in the quiet after the slap, I stopped seeing myself as a victim and started seeing myself as someone who still had choices. And that knowledge, small, stubborn, unwavering, felt like the first true step toward whatever came next. That night, while they slept in my room, I sat in the kitchen with a single candle. The house was silent except for the ticking of the old clock above the stove. Shadows stretched across the walls I had once painted with my husband, back when we thought love could make a home eternal. I stared at that flame and thought of him. My husband had been a gentle man with hands rough from years of work and a laugh that always made my burdens lighter. This was our house. We planted roses in the front garden, we carved our initials into the wooden beam of the porch, and we dreamed aloud of our son's future, as though it were already written in the stars. I thought of the nights he'd come home exhausted, loosening his tie, and say, "Katherine, we're building something that will outlive us. Don't ever let anyone take it away from you." His voice was clear in my memory, so clear it felt as though he were sitting across from me, nodding, reminding me that I wasn't alone even if the room looked empty. And then I remembered his words that had carried me through so many storms. Never let anyone steal your dignity. A house can be rebuilt, but once you give away your self-respect, it's gone forever. For the first time in weeks, I lifted my chin. My cheek still stung from the slap, but instead of weakness, I felt a spark of resolve. They had taken my peace. They had taken my laughter, but they would not take my dignity. The next morning, with the sunrise pouring through the windows like a blessing, I made a decision. I would no longer be silent. I picked up the phone with hands steadier than I expected and called Mr. Harris, the lawyer who had been my husband's friend. His voice, warm and calm, answered on the first ring. "Katherine," he said, "it's been too long." The words tumbled out of me. The insults, the demands, the silence of my son, and finally, the slap. Each sentence felt like unloading a stone I had been carrying in my chest. By the end, my voice cracked, but it didn't break. Mr. Harris listened quietly, letting me pour out the hurt. When I finished, he spoke firmly but gently. "Katherine, this house is legally yours. Your husband made sure of that before he passed. No one can take it from you unless you allow it. You have more power than you realize." I pressed the phone to my ear and closed my eyes. Those words were like cool water after wandering through a desert. For the first time in weeks, I felt relief. Not complete, but enough to breathe again. When I hung up, I stood taller. I wasn't just a fragile old woman. I was a mother, a widow, a fighter, and I would not be erased from my own home. But strength isn't built in a single moment. It grows in small, deliberate steps. That day, I began taking those steps. First, I gathered all the important papers, the deed, the will, the receipts my husband had so carefully stored in an old leather folder. My hands lingered on his handwriting, neat and steady, and for a moment I felt as though he were guiding me still. Then I began writing, not to them, but to myself. A letter of sorts. I wrote, "Katherine, you are not invisible. You are not weak. This house carries your story. If they choose cruelty, that is their burden, not yours." Writing it down steadied me, as though the ink on the page turned fleeting thoughts into promises I could not break. That afternoon, I did something small but powerful. I cooked. Not for them, but for myself. I pulled out my husband's favorite recipe, chicken stew with herbs from the garden. The smell filled the kitchen, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the house respond to me, as if it remembered who it truly belonged to. Of course, when they woke and smelled the food, my daughter-in-law sneered. "You shouldn't waste money on useless meals," she said, her words sharp. My son said nothing. But this time I didn't shrink. I sat at the table, spoon in hand, and ate slowly, deliberately. Every bite tasted like defiance, like reclaiming something they had tried to strip from me. Later, I began to prepare in other ways. I quietly set aside a little money, tucked into a tin where only I would find it. I called Mrs. Ahmed, my neighbor, and confided in her. She held my hand and said, "You've carried everyone else's burdens, Katherine. It's time to carry your own with pride." Her support was a reminder that kindness still existed beyond my walls. Each night, I returned to the kitchen candle. It became my ritual, my way of steadying my soul. I prayed quietly, not for revenge, but for courage. I asked for the strength to endure whatever was coming, to protect what was mine without losing the gentleness in my heart. And with each prayer, my resolve grew. I noticed changes in myself. My steps no longer faltered when I walked through the hall. My eyes no longer lowered when she glared at me. I began to see her cruelty for what it was, not power, but insecurity. She wanted control because she had no peace inside her, and I began to pity her instead of fearing her. The day came when she tried again, her voice sharp. "Why don't you sign the house over to us? It makes sense, doesn't it? You're old, Katherine. What do you even need it for?" This time, I looked her straight in the eye and said, "What I need is dignity, and you will not take that from me." Her mouth fell open. She wasn't used to me answering back. My son shifted uncomfortably beside her, and though he said nothing, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Shame, perhaps, or the first sting of realization. That night, as I lay in the small guest room, I smiled to myself. Not because the battle was over, but because I had finally stepped back into myself. The woman who had been buried under weeks of humiliation and silence had risen again. I wasn't waiting to be saved anymore. I was saving myself. And in that truth, I found strength deeper than I had ever known. I would fight if I had to. I would stand alone if I had to. But one thing was certain. I would never be erased from my own home. The confrontation came a week later. The house was quiet, almost eerily so, as I moved from room to room, packing their belongings into bags. Every folded shirt, every pair of shoes, every perfume bottle was placed neatly by the front door. My hands didn't tremble this time. There was no fear, only resolve. When I finally finished, I sat in the living room with my back straight, the old family clock ticking steadily beside me. That sound, once a comfort, now felt like a drum announcing the moment of truth. I heard the car pull into the driveway, the sound of voices, her sharp and commanding, his tired and hesitant. The front door opened and they stepped inside. For a heartbeat, silence filled the air as their eyes fell on the packed bags lined up like soldiers waiting for orders. "What is this?" my daughter-in-law snapped, her voice high-pitched with disbelief. I stood. My knees were not as strong as they once were, but they carried me with the dignity of a queen reclaiming her throne. "I will not live in fear in my own home," I said firmly. My voice did not shake. My white hair framed my face like a crown, my glasses reflecting the light of my resolve. She laughed bitterly, tossing her hair back as though I were nothing more than a stubborn child. "You can't survive without us. You're old, Katherine. Alone, you'll wither like dust." But I smiled, a sad, knowing smile that came from a place she could never touch. "No," I replied softly. "I survived without you for 55 years. I built this home with love, with sacrifice, with my husband's hands beside mine. I raised my son, I buried my husband, and I endured every storm life threw at me. And I will survive again. What I cannot survive is the poison of cruelty in my own walls." For a moment, her smirk faltered. She wasn't used to me standing tall. She wasn't used to me reminding her that my life had meaning can't, gnawing long before she walked through my door. Then I turned to my son. His eyes would not meet mine at first. He shifted, uncomfortable, his silence once again pressing against me like a weight. But then, for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a crack in his armor. His eyes glistened, his jaw trembled, and finally, his voice broke through the stillness. "Mom," he whispered, the single word trembling with regret. I wanted to run to him, to hold him, to pretend nothing had happened, and that the boy I once raised still lived inside this man. My heart screamed for reconciliation, but I stood my ground. Love cannot exist without respect, and he had chosen silence over me too many times. "It's too late," I said softly, but firmly. "You stood by while she tried to strip me of everything your father and I built. You stood by while she raised her hand against me. You stood by while I cried in my own home. I am your mother, but you chose her cruelty over my dignity." His tears fell then, one after another. For a fleeting second, I saw guilt tearing through him, but it wasn't enough. Regret without change is nothing but another form of betrayal. My daughter-in-law grabbed his arm sharply. "Don't listen to her dramatics," she hissed. "She's just bitter. Let's go. We don't need this house. We can make our own." Her arrogance filled the room, but this time it didn't crush me. It passed over me like smoke that could no longer choke my lungs. I stepped aside and pointed to the door. "Your bags are packed. Take them. Leave this house. Leave me in peace." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, they lifted their bags. My son glanced back one last time, his lips trembling as if he wanted to say more, but no words came. And perhaps that was the truest answer of all. They left. The door closed with a final echoing thud, and for the first time in a long while, the house felt like mine again. I stood in the hallway, breathing deeply, letting the silence wrap around me like a long-lost friend. I touched the walls with my fingertips, feeling the grooves, the paint, the very heartbeat of the home I had once thought lost. Each step I took through the hallways was like reclaiming pieces of myself. Yes, the sting of betrayal still lingered. Yes, the memory of that slap would never fully fade, but neither would my strength. Neither would the dignity I had fought to preserve. I walked into the kitchen, lit a candle, and whispered into the flame, "I did it." For a moment, I imagined my husband standing there, smiling proudly, his arm around me, telling me I had honored his memory. Tears filled my eyes, but they were no longer only tears of grief. They were tears of victory. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Alone, yes, but not broken. And so, to everyone listening, hear me when I say this. Never let anyone steal your dignity. They may take your comfort, they may take your company, but if you guard your self-respect, you will never truly lose. Even if it means standing alone, stand tall. Because sometimes losing people is how we finally find ourselves. Sometimes closing a door on others is the only way to open the door back to your own soul. I found myself again that day, not as someone's mother, not as someone's wife, but as Katherine, a woman who refused to be erased. And if you are listening right now, sitting in your own silence, wondering if you have the strength, you do. You always have. Stand tall, protect your dignity, and remember, love is a gift, not a weapon. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Sometimes sharing these moments feels like tearing open old wounds, but I believe that by telling them, we remind each other that dignity, respect, and love are worth fighting for. If this story touched your age, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Katherine Stories so you never miss another journey like this one. And before you go, tell me in the comments, have you ever had to stand up for your dignity even when it cost you relationships? Your stories matter too, and I'd love to read them. Until next time, and this is Katherine, reminding you, never let anyone take your worth away. Even if it means standing alone, stand tall.